Most organizations know their supply chains carry ESG risk, but the real challenge is understanding where that risk actually sits. ESG Category Risk Mapping helps procurement teams identify where environmental, social, and governance exposures are concentrated across procurement categories, industries, and sourcing regions. Unlike traditional supplier risk management, this method focuses on structural risk patterns across categories rather than evaluating suppliers one by one. The key idea is simple. ESG risk does not distribute evenly across the supply base. It clusters by category, sector, and geography. Traditional supplier risk management evaluates vendors individually and asks whether a supplier is financially stable or compliant. ESG category risk mapping asks a different question. What sustainability risks are structurally embedded inside a procurement category itself? Procurement teams evaluate carbon intensity, labor risks, health and safety exposure, corruption exposure, and regulatory risks across categories and sourcing regions. The output is usually a risk matrix or heat map that helps prioritize where enhanced due diligence is needed. This practice matters because much of ESG risk sits beyond Tier 1 suppliers, where procurement teams often have limited visibility. High-spend categories are not always the highest risk categories. For example, agricultural commodities, mining inputs, or specialty chemicals may carry far greater ESG exposure than categories with much larger spend volumes. Without category-level prioritization, organizations spread due diligence efforts too evenly and fail to focus resources where the greatest risks exist. Regulations such as CSRD and supply chain due diligence frameworks increasingly expect systematic risk identification across procurement categories. Many organizations fail because they rely only on generic country risk indices without understanding category-specific exposure. Others organize spend using accounting codes that do not align with procurement categories, making ESG analysis difficult. Some companies limit assessments only to Tier 1 suppliers and ignore deeper supply chain exposure. Another common mistake is treating ESG risk mapping as a one-time exercise instead of continuously updating risk profiles as sourcing regions and supply chains evolve. The first implementation step is mapping procurement categories and spend exposure. Organizations organize spend using a structured procurement taxonomy such as UNSPSC, or an internal category tree. Procurement teams identify categories with high spend concentration, operational criticality, or large supplier bases. In practice, this requires cross-referencing spend data with category structures and validating the information with category managers to ensure the categories reflect real sourcing activity. The second step is assessing ESG risk factors by category and geography. Environmental risks include carbon intensity, hazardous materials, water use, and waste generation. Social risks include wages, working conditions, subcontracted labor, and health and safety exposure. Governance risks include corruption, weak regulatory enforcement, and compliance failures in sourcing regions. Organizations combine sector benchmarks with geographic risk indicators to create ESG risk scores for each category. The third step is integrating ESG risk insights directly into procurement decisions. High-risk categories trigger enhanced due diligence, supplier audits, ESG questionnaires, and stronger contractual clauses. Procurement teams can include ESG scores directly into sourcing evaluations and supplier selection criteria. Risk mapping should also feed into ongoing supplier monitoring and be reviewed regularly as sourcing conditions change. A strong example comes from the electronics industry. Electronics manufacturers often identify conflict minerals such as tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold as high-risk procurement categories due to sourcing from conflict-affected regions. Although these materials may represent a relatively small share of total spend, they carry severe social and governance exposure. Companies respond by requiring smelter disclosure data, responsible sourcing certifications, and corrective action processes, while lower-risk categories receive standard supplier onboarding. Effective ESG category risk mapping becomes a long-term procurement capability rather than a one-time project. Mature organizations maintain category risk registers, combine inherent category risk with geographic context, and integrate ESG requirements directly into sourcing strategies. Category managers own risk management responsibilities, while procurement KPIs and leadership dashboards track ESG performance over time. The real value of ESG category risk mapping is not the heat map itself, but the better procurement decisions it enables.